Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. Thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate everybody coming, and I know we've had a few of these public meetings, so it's good to see some of you guys again, and appreciate you coming for this public hearing. We have a good presentation, I think, for you today, and we can certainly answer any questions one-on-one too over by the boards or exhibits when we're done with the presentation. To introduce myself, I'm Matt Kinsella. I'm the project manager with Apex Engineering Group. With me also presenting today is Jake Nordic from SRF. We're part of the consulting team that the DOT and the city have hired for this project. In addition to Apex and SRF, we have a few other consultant partners, which I've shown here up on the screen on the right. And then we also have other agency partners that have been an important part of this project as well. The DOT and the City of Fargo, of course, are the lead agencies for this project, but Federal Highway Administration and the Fargo-Moorhead Metropolitan Council of Governments have really been important members of this project too, and part of the process here as we've gotten to this point. So before we dive into the details, just a few of the housekeeping items here. Make sure that you sign in on the table in the back. I think most of you probably did when you came in, but just make sure you do that. We also have an informational handout available for you to grab and take. There's printed comment forms if you prefer to write your comments on a form and either leave them here or you can mail them in. I think there's an address on the form as well. And we do have a public participation survey that is optional, but we'd like to encourage you to try to take that if you can. That's data that helps the DOT as they collect that from some of these different projects and meetings. And then finally, too, we do have our 3D visualizations, which are on the tables. I know a number of you guys are already looking at those earlier. And then we have an interactive sidewalk station back here that Jeff is working really hard on. So thank you, Jeff, for doing that. Kind of an opportunity to see what some of those different sidewalk widths along the corridor might look like that we're talking about here today with the preferred alternative. So I'm not going to spend too much on this slide because I think everybody knows where the project is, but just to highlight that there's 4 miles of Main Avenue, which is also US Highway 10 within the city of Fargo. And this is really the last mile that hasn't been touched within the last 10 or 20 years. So this is an important project that has been needed for a while due to some of the needs that are out there. And then in purple, the downtown project, of course, which most of you are familiar with, was done just a few years ago as well. So as we look at those 4 miles, one of the interesting things about this corridor in Fargo is how much it changes from one side to the other. So as we look west of our project area, between 45th Street and 25th Street, you can see we have a 6-lane section. We have 3 lanes each direction. We've got dedicated left turn lanes, sometimes right turn lanes as well. But then when we look to the east with the project that was just rebuilt a couple of years ago, that section changes from a 5-lane section down to a 4-lane and ultimately a 3-lane as you approach the roundabout at 2nd Street. So this context of the surrounding corridor definitely played into our alternative development with this project. The other thing that has been interesting, I guess I don't know if interesting is the right word or challenging with this corridor, is the narrow right-of-way that we have between 17th Street and University Drive. We only have 60 feet of right-of-way available to work in that, well, to fit what we're trying to do in that area. And as you can see on the screen, sometimes that 60 feet is literally between building face to building face. So that obviously constrains some of the things that we're able to do as well. Those of you that were here last year, this slide is essentially the same, but one of the first things we do on these projects is really work with our team to develop the purpose and need for the project, our why, as far as why we're doing the project. And these bullets really boil down our purpose and need, I would say, pretty well. A couple just to highlight here, bullet number 2, improving the pedestrian environment. That's been really important to the project team from day one. I think those of you that have walked out on Main Avenue understand that that's something that we can definitely improve. The photo on the lower left shows an example of a really tight sidewalk with the building, and then of course the travel lanes right adjacent to that as well, with not a lot of room to operate. And then the photo on the lower right, the other thing we really looked at with this corridor is trying to close and consolidate access. I think there's about 80 driveways within this 1 mile stretch of Main Avenue. So I know we've met with many of you a few times, and we appreciate everybody's willingness to look at opportunities to close some of those. And Jake will talk about that here in a little bit on how we were successful, I think, in trying to do that. So on federally funded projects like this, one of the first things that we have to do is go through what they call the NEPA process. And that stands for the National Environmental Policy Act. And that's a process that's required for, required for federal actions that have the federal funding to make sure that we're studying and disclosing any environmental effects or impacts that might come out of what we're trying to do with the project before we make decisions. And there are 3 classes of action for that process. I'll just kind of highlight them here quickly for everybody. The first class is called an environmental impact statement. I would call that the most complex class, where you already know that you're going to have significant impacts with what you're doing, and so you need to really do a detailed study of what you're looking at. And then class 2 is called a categorical exclusion. That's probably on the other end of the spectrum. That's maybe the least complex class that we go through, where you're pretty sure you're not going to have significant impacts, so you just start kind of down that track and see where things go. And then the third class is kind of in between those two. It's an environmental assessment. It's when you're not really sure if your alternatives or your project is going to have significant impacts or not. So the Main Avenue project that we're talking about today, it started as a class 2 categorical exclusion, so that it started where we were thinking when we started the project, we're not going to have anything that would elevate to significant impacts on this project. And then as we worked through our alternative development last year and met with a lot of you and developed our alternatives and worked with our project team, it was determined that because we had some alternatives that impacted buildings and could potentially cause relocations, that definitely was something that would be a significant impact. So the project team stepped back at that point. We looked at that and we said, you know what, we need to elevate this environmental process to an environmental assessment so that we can look more closely at these impacts. So that's really what has caused the delay that some of you know about with this project. It added about another year to our project schedule, but I think it's been really well worth it because we were able to take that detailed look at some of these things. So that's kind of how we got to the environmental assessment. We did start that process in February of this year. FHWA and the DOT were joint lead agencies with the City of Fargo as a participating agency. And that's what we've been doing. We've been working through that, really taking a close look in a number of different environmental categories at the alternatives and their potential impacts. And we've made it through that process. We were able to get the EA finished and signed by FHWA here in late October. And so then that's kind of why we're here today. So now what happens next is that gets released for public inspection. It was released on November 1st. There's a 30-day review period now where it's open. The EA and the selection, or the recommendation of preferred alternatives that are in the EA are open for public comment now for 30 days until December 1st. And then at that point, we'll take that information and go back with FHWA and see if we can get to the end of the environmental clearance process, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the EA does include those recommendations for a preferred alternative. And you'll see this stamp on a number of our exhibits today and also in the presentation here that we go through. So that'll just kind of help you track the items that have been recommended as part of the preferred alternative with the project. So this timeline summarizes where we are currently at and our current tentative schedule going forward. So you can see we did have to lengthen that environmental clearance process, but we are reaching the end, or getting closer to the end of that process. And then right now, tentatively moving into design and construction in the next couple of years, with construction tentatively slated for 26 and 27. And it is good to keep in mind that anything shown really from this date forward, the 24 to 27 dates, are tentative and subject to change. So starting to jump into a few of the details here, and then I'll turn it over to Jake for some from alternative discussions. One of the first things that we had to do with this project is collect traffic data and then figure out how are we going to forecast this data out to 2045, which is our design year. So what we're trying to show here in this graph on the left, the year is on the bottom as you look at that, the bottom axis there, and then the vertical axis on the left is the number of vehicles per day, so what we would call ADT, or average daily traffic. And then if you want to focus first on the line that has the blue and the orange, or the blue dots with the orange dash line, those blue dots represent collected data up until 2020, well, I guess it was about 2018. So from 2005 to 2018, you can see that's kind of what traffic was doing on Main Avenue. It was growing slowly a little bit every couple of years. And so that orange line was what we really expected that track to continue to be as you move forward. But with COVID, of course, everybody knows things kind of changed as far as the way people use a lot of our corridors around town. So when we went out and collected the data in 2021, that gray dot is actually what we collected, which is about 5,000 vehicles less than what we would have expected based on the way that things were trending. So we worked with our project team to see how did we want to manage that gap, and what we were expecting and really what we should be projecting forward after that. And ultimately we decided to go kind of in the middle of those two, as you can see with that yellow dot. And then we took that and used that to forecast out with the green dash line out to what our 2045 forecast would be. So a couple key findings from the traffic analysis. We found that the current through lane capacity out on the corridor was adequate for that 2045 traffic. We didn't need to add any through lanes to the corridor. And in combination with that, we also found, as we kind of tested some different lane configurations, that we could reduce the lanes east of 18th Street while we could do that if we kept the same capacity west of 18th Street, and that would still provide an acceptable level of service, or LOS, on the corridor. So that really helped inform some of our alternative development as we moved into that part of the project. And just a couple other findings here. The crash history on the corridor, we do study that it was a little bit higher than average, but it was below what would be considered critical. So there wasn't anything immediate that we needed to do there, but we certainly keep that in mind as we develop our alternatives. And then we already talked about the access points and how we wanted to really try to reduce those with the project. With that, I'll turn it over to Jake.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Hello, everyone. Now we're going to talk about the alternative development process, what alternatives were moved forward as part of the environmental document, and really what we're trying to do and achieve with the purpose and need that Matt discussed before was provide some consistency between all the alternatives. And one of them is the segment west of 17th to 25th Street is maintaining that 5-lane section. We determined there was a need there. We have the right-of-way room and capacity to do that. ADA compliance and the improved pedestrian environment with sidewalks, providing a continuous center left turn lane along the entire corridor. Right now, that center left turn lane only exists from 18th Street to 25th Street. And construct new sidewalk along the entire corridor. Those pedestrian improvements, nearly 8,000 feet of sidewalk will be replaced. Reducing one lane of through traffic in the westbound direction between 17th and University Drive. And as discussed earlier, that management of those access points. We've talked a lot with the property owners, a lot of you in the room here today, about how we can provide additional safety benefits when it comes to access in and out of properties. And then also as part of this, replacing the storm sewer, sanitary sewer, water main, all those underground utilities with this, as well as improve the lighting. So we did develop some design criteria to follow, and we worked closely with the city and the state on developing these. Travel lanes will be 11 feet wide. That center left turn lane will be 12 feet wide. And then sidewalk and boulevard widths, sidewalks, we're shooting for a minimum of 6 feet of sidewalk both on the north and the south end, and also a minimum 4-foot stamped colored concrete boulevard, which separates those pedestrians from the traffic, as well as provides opportunity for light poles, signs, and any other aesthetics such as tree plantings and stuff for the corridor. So when the project first started, we decided with the changing environment along the corridor with the number of lanes that are currently out there, we decided to split up the corridor into 2 segments. The segment from 23rd Street to 17th Street, and also from 17th to University Drive. For all the alternatives between that segment between 23rd and 27th is going to remain a 5-lane section, and we're just going to improve that section. So really the number of lanes is going to change between that section, just improvements for pedestrians and other amenities. Now the segment between 17th Street and University Drive, well, these are where the alternatives are going to be discussed in more detail. Throughout the process, we did determine that one of the alternatives will be removed from consideration because of the amount of impacts it does have, and that was continuing that 5-lane section from the west all the way to University. So that was removed and was determined as part of the environmental process to move the following alternatives forward. We did add an alternative. It's more of a modification of one of the alternatives, and it's really to minimize some of the impacts that alternative originally had. So the alternatives that are going to be moving forward through the environmental process was an alternative. Alternative A is a no build, and basically that is a do nothing, project doesn't happen. No improvements. Alternative C, this is a 4-lane alternative. Remember, these are all alternatives between 17th and University. 4-lane alternative, and that was broken out into 3 separate alternatives or sub-alternatives, I guess, for that 4-lane option. One with building impacts, one with shifting an alignment slightly to the south to avoid some impacts to some buildings, and also modified design criteria that we talked about previously that would eliminate those building impacts. And then lastly, alternative D was a 3-lane. We also looked at some options at specific locations along the corridor. Option 1 was widening the sidewalk from 23rd to 25th Street. This would provide some continuity with the sidewalk and the network for bicyclists as well. And this is on the south side of the corridor. Option 2 is provide a raised median at 17th Street. And option 3 was to reconstruct curb lines with that reduced lane just to the west of University. What's been recommended by the project team and the stakeholders was to move forward with recommending a preferred alternative of alternative C2, which is the 4-lane with modified design criteria and no building impacts. And then for the options, option 1 with that widened sidewalk at the west end of the project, as well as option 3 is reconstructing the curb line just west of University Drive. So a little bit in detail on the alternatives. Alternative A is a no build. Like I said before, no improvements, the project doesn't happen. No improvements along the entire corridor. We have to move forward with this as an option to consider as we look at all the impacts and evaluation of the alternatives. The segment between 23rd Street and 17th Street was selected to move forward as a recommendation. Again, this is the only alternative really for this segment was just to reconstruct the current segment, maintaining those 2 lanes in the eastbound and westbound direction with that center left turn lane. And also all improvements along this corridor between 23rd and 17th will be constructed within the existing footprint of the right-of-way. So no widening of the existing right-of-way. Here's a cross-section of what that will look like. Again, 5-lane section, widened sidewalk and boulevard improvements, and also some replacing of some amenities. Again, everything within the existing right-of-way. We're going to show visualizations of each of these, just a quick snapshot of it, just to get that picture of what it could look like. We do have extended versions of these that go along the entire corridor at the tables there on the monitors if you wanted to take a closer look at other areas that may not show up on this short clip. So as you can see, around 21st Street here, it's very similar to what it looks like today with just some of those widened pedestrian improvements and reconstruction of those sidewalks. The roadway will be reconstructed but put back with a 5-lane section. Alternative C1, now Alternative C are all 4-lane alternatives, but Alternative C1 is a 4-lane with kind of that ultimate build with the design criteria, which in turn resulted in building impacts. So there will be 2 eastbound lanes, 1 westbound lane, and then that center turn lane. So out there today, there are 4 lanes currently in this segment, but it's 2 lanes in each direction with no center left turn lane. So we're going to take one of those lanes and turn it into a 2-way left turn lane. Existing right-of-way out there is 60 feet. Typically, it varies plus or minus just a little bit. But with the proposed improvements with the widened sidewalk and corridor, new right-of-way width of 70 feet is proposed. And with that, there are 7 building impacts, and the right-of-way needed for that additional 5 feet on each side is what we're going to be requiring for additional right-of-way to have that wider footprint. So here's a cross-section showing that widened footprint from 60 to 70 feet. As you can see, shows a building impact and how that building is impacted with the widened sidewalk and the boulevards, as well as that. And then as well as on the other side, having a wider footprint for additional sidewalk width where there are no buildings. Here's a visualization of what that looks like, and as you can see, it shows what those building impacts, where that building currently is, and how the footprint of this new wider section does impact the corridor. Alternative C1, option 4 is still that maintaining that desired widths for sidewalks, lanes, as well as boulevards. Same right-of-way width, same lane configurations. There is going to be a 6-foot shift from the roadway alignment to the south to avoid one of those building impacts to those buildings. So that's what this cross-section represents. That building is not impacted, but additional right-of-way or additional width on the other side of the roadway is going to be required. We don't have a visualization for this one, but we are showing a plan view that shows that shift towards the right side there. It shifts towards the south, missing the building, and then comes back as you go to the left of the page. The alignment comes back to the normal alignment along the corridor. So the shift only happens in this short area. But you do miss the building, but the impacts to the south are greater from a right-of-way need as well. Alternative C2, 4-lane section, same lane configuration with a 2 eastbound, 1 westbound, and a center left turn lane. And this is going to be with modified design criteria. So with that modified design criteria, we're not going to need as big of a right-of-way footprint. It's a 60-foot or 68 foot compared to the 70 foot of alternative C1. No building impacts as part of this one, and I'll show you here what the changes to those design criteria are, but this is the recommended alternative that has been preferred to move forward. So the modified design criteria, the lane widths will be narrowed slightly, going from 11 feet to 10.5 feet. The center left turn lane will be narrowed from a 12-foot to 11-foot width. And then the sidewalks adjacent to buildings. So this is only at the building locations. That 6-foot sidewalk, minimum 6-foot sidewalk will be adjusted to 5 feet. And the boulevard width will be, that minimum 4 will be adjusted to 2 feet. So it'll be 7 feet instead of the 10 feet that was for the alternative C1. And really this only occurs about 500 feet total along the entire corridor, just where those buildings are right up against that right of way. And to avoid those impacts, this modified design criteria for the sidewalk and boulevards will occur. And I'll show you that on the cross section here and then also on the visualization. So here you're showing that 5-foot sidewalk with that 2-foot boulevard on the left, right adjacent to those buildings. But on the other side, we're still meeting that desired 4-foot boulevard and 6-foot sidewalk on the other side. And then also with the lane configuration too, with the widths is slightly reduced. So at the top of the screen, as I run this, you'll see what that modified sidewalk section looks like, where you can see it narrows up a little bit on the boulevard and the sidewalk widths at the top of the screen there. Again, those only occur at the building locations. The last alternative was a 3-lane section, alternative D. That's one eastbound and one westbound with a center left turn lane. The eastbound lanes, as you can remember from the other alternatives, there's 2 lanes. So there will be a lane drop at 18th Street, which is the signalized intersection. And the existing right-of-way width of 60 feet will be maintained. So there will be minimal right-of-way impacts along the corridor. Most everything will be able to be built within the existing footprint with this 3-lane alternative. And with this, you get a little bit of bigger sidewalk width, a little bit wider sidewalks and boulevard to build within the existing footprint. And as a result, you have one less lane. And that's what this alternative looks like on the visualization. 1 lane in each direction with that center left turn lane, a little bit wider sidewalk widths for the pedestrians. We show here some examples, and then now these pictures were taken on the corridor, the Main Avenue corridor that was reconstructed here a couple of years ago. And it just shows what this new section of corridor will look like. One really good representation of alternative C2, which is the recommended alternative. That picture on the left is 7.3 total feet, which is very similar to what that would look like in front of those buildings as part of alternative C2, which is a 5-foot sidewalk, 2-foot boulevard. And then, as you go further to the right there, meeting more of those desired sidewalk and boulevard widths with the wider 6-foot sidewalk, 4-foot boulevard. We'll also be looking at any streetscaping opportunities, whether that's tree plantings in the boulevard, planting beds where there's opportunity to do that. We'll also be looking at parking lot separation if that's a desire to separate a little bit of that parking lot that may have parking spaces that abut right up against the sidewalk to provide a little bit more safety and separation between the pedestrians and the parking lot. So we'll be working with property owners on opportunities to do those as well. So in summary, on the alternatives, here's just a table that shows what those impacts are. Again, alternative C1, both the 4-lane and the option 4 with the shift, have those building impacts, larger amount of right-of-way need, and also more impacts to signs, private signs, parking lots, and all that, as far as number of properties that may be impacted with some encroachments. Alternative C2 is the recommended alternative. No building impacts, but it does require right-of-way from the adjacent properties for that widened sidewalk width. And those will be done in strip takings. Alternative D, really not much for right-of-way impacts or impacts to any buildings, since we are removing a lane for that alternative. Be able to build within the existing footprint. Access management, we have approximately 80 driveways along the corridor. We've talked with a lot of you that are in the room here about opportunities. We've confirmed that there will be about 24 that we could close along the corridor, and there's potential further conversation on approximately 7 more. So if all those move forward with modification, either closure or consolidation, we're looking at a 39% reduction in total access points along the corridor. The options, so these are just strictly in certain locations and can be applied with any of the alternatives. The widened sidewalk from 23rd to 25th, which is at the Simonson Lumberyard on the south side. Providing that widened sidewalk really provides more connectivity and safety for pedestrians and separation from the oncoming traffic, and really ties into the plans for bike lanes and stuff, future bike lanes to the west, and provides that connectivity between the corridors. It also improves the crossing over at the railroad spur line as well. Provides a better angle to cross those tracks, so wheels such as bikes or wheelchairs don't get stuck in the track lanes. Raised median at 17th Street. This would prohibit left turn in and out of 17th Street. With the proximity of this so close to 18th that's signalized, this option removes any left turning and conflicting movements. This alternative was not recommended to move forward by the project team. Option 3 is the reconstruction of the north curb line. And as you can see, towards the University Drive intersection, it's just moving that existing curb line out further into the lane to delineate that one lane of westbound traffic a little better. And on the east side of University Drive, as for those that are familiar with it, you're coming from a 3-lane section or one lane from the east that does develop into a through lane now because there's 2 lanes currently on Main Avenue, but that lane that develops will stay a turn lane only to go on the counterflow lane on University. So there won't be a lane developed from the east. It'll just develop into a turn lane. All right, Matt will now discuss some of the project funding and other items.
Thanks, Jake. I promise we're getting close to the end here. We're almost there, so hang with us. So with that exciting discussion about cost and project funding, how are we going to pay for all this stuff and how much is it going to cost? So what you can see here, I guess what I'll highlight on the screen for you is the first column. You can see that the engineering and construction costs for all 4 of these are really pretty similar. I mean, there's not a lot of difference there because that footprint isn't too different, as Jake said, from right-of-way line to right-of-way line. But where you do see some of the difference is in that second column with the land acquisition and the building impacts. You can see that alternative C1 and alternative C1 plus option 4, because they had those building impacts and require relocations, full property purchases, building purchases, they end up quite a bit more expensive than the other alternatives, as you can see with the totals in the third column. And these are 2026 dollars that we inflated these to. The funding for the project will be a combination of federal, state, and city dollars. We've kind of laid out the ranges, what that might look like, and this is dependent on which alternative is chosen. Of course, as we mentioned, C2 has been recommended right now as the preferred alternative. But you can see the mix of funding there, and the city share will be a combination of assessments, city sales tax dollars, and utility funds. So another item of interest to a lot of you as property owners and business owners is something that we call encroachment. So when we have federal funding on these projects, we have to go through and look at if there's anything encroaching the right-of-way. That could be parking, but a lot of times it's just signs and awnings. That's kind of what we see on this corridor, where you have a sign overhanging over the right-of-way. So we went through and did that, and there's 49 of them on the corridor, so there is quite a few. And we will be working with those of you that have those through the next year and a half as we work through that design process. The goal is to try to permit as many of those as we can with the DOT, meaning that you'd be able to leave it in place, but the DOT would do a permit with you as a landowner or business owner. That's definitely the goal, but I can tell you that there are some that will need to be relocated. And we have information on that we can, if anyone that has any questions on that, we can look at that with you here after the presentation. And then also just mentioning here on the slide that we are going to have to coordinate with BNSF as well on this project, as they do own 4 properties on the north side of Main Avenue. So we looked at a lot of different environmental categories, as I mentioned, as part of the EA. And the one on this slide, I guess, that I want to highlight is on the bottom, the environmental justice. We actually went through and did a full environmental justice study. NDOT and FHWA have guidelines on what needs to be done to look at that. And essentially what we're doing is we're looking at the corridor and the surrounding area to see if there's low-income or minority populations that exist in that area. And we do have information. There's a board up here that if anybody has questions about that, we can go through. And then the EA itself does have a copy of the study. But we did find that those populations did exist within the corridor. And then that kind of played into some of the alternative discussions, as I'll talk about here on the next slide. So there's a lot to see on this slide, but mainly what I wanted to do here is just highlight a few of the key differences between these 4 alternatives as we looked at them. So the C alternatives, as Jake mentioned earlier, those all have the 4 through lanes. So they're going to have the 2 eastbound lanes, whereas alternative D just has the 1 eastbound lane. So that obviously is a difference between those. The other main difference too between C1 and C1 plus option 4 and the other ones is those building impacts. Those do have, as Jake outlined, 7 or 6 building impacts depending on alternative, and up to 31 business relocations that result from those. So as I mentioned earlier, that environmental justice study, that combined with looking at these alternatives, that really led to one of the key findings of the EA, which I've highlighted here in yellow, and that is that alternative C1, it was determined, did have disproportionately higher adverse impacts to an environmental justice population due to the 18 businesses that are in the International Market Plaza that would be forced to relocate as part of that alternative. So again, a slide with a lot of information and colors up here. So I'll try to break this down for you. Starting on the left, this is really the process then that the project team went through. So we had all that data, we had the evaluation. It's okay, what are we going to do with this data? How are we going to try to rate these alternatives? So what we did is we came up with the 6 categories on the left, and those categories had a number of subcategories underneath them that we looked at as well, but they really rolled up to those categories. And then we worked with the DOT, the city, and then we also took into account all the public input we've received, whether it was from individual meetings with a lot of you, or the public meeting last year, or the workshops we did last April. We took all that and we came up with a weighting, kind of an average weighting for these categories, which is shown in the second column. And so basically what that means is the ones that are shown in larger text, the DOT, the city, and the public input determined that those had a higher weight. So you can see, for example, vehicular safety was weighted as the highest category of these 6, whereas project cost and schedule down on the bottom was weighted as the lowest. And the reason that the team did that is just to make sure that we were factoring in all of that information and not just assigning numbers to these categories and they all have the same weight. So that's essentially what that means, what you see up there. And then we went through and rated everything. Obviously all that stuff got kind of rolled up, the weights applied, and then you see the totals on the bottom. So those are essentially the total rating for each alternative. And what you can see is that alternative C2 and alternative D definitely separated themselves from the other alternatives. So those both certainly were viable alternatives in the eyes of the team, but ultimately C2 was the one that was recommended as the preferred alternative. Just a little bit about construction here and kind of how we envision it right now. Probably the best way to boil this down is very similar to the approach that was taken on the downtown Main Avenue project, for those of you that were familiar with that. We're going to try to do it a few blocks at a time so that we're not not disrupting businesses for a really long time, trying to keep that down to as little disruption as possible. The goal is to take through traffic out of the work zone, so we want to detour through traffic and use First Avenue North for that, and also use a truck detour to get some of the large trucks out of there that are just traveling through. But most importantly, we are going to maintain business access. We understand the importance of that. And in one way or another, we're going to make sure that we maintain that access during construction. All right, we're almost wrapped up here. So just kind of a next steps slide here to show you what some of the next things are to expect. We've already kind of accomplished the first three things on the list here. We're at the public hearing. We're in the middle of this 30-day comment period. That ends December 1st, as I mentioned earlier. And then what we'll do is we'll take all the public comments that are received at that time and we'll compile those. And that gets included in something that we'll send out to the entire project team. And we'll meet in mid-December and review all that public comment that we received so that FHWA can factor that into the next step, which is shown on the last row there. Hopefully early next year, January or February, FHWA will be issuing the final determination on whether we've made it to the end of this environmental process. Do we have a finding of no significant impact with the preferred alternative, or do we need to continue more environmental analysis? So that's kind of where we're going here with the next few months. So assuming that we do receive a finding of no significant impact in early next year, that'll kick us into the final design and right-of-way acquisition phase of the project. That'll be really over the next year and a half, and there'll be a lot of contact with those of you that own property or businesses on the corridor. We'll continue to work with you, whether it's access locations, widths, or property that we might need to acquire. And so right now, as you can see, tentatively, we have that scheduled to finish in late summer of 2025, with construction starting in spring of 2026. And again, these are tentative and subject to change. Okay, I think we made it to the end, and I guess my voice is running out, so that's probably good. A few things here on commenting. We do want to hear from you. If you want to verbally comment after this presentation, that's absolutely welcome. We would just ask, we've got Carolyn here recording everything for us, so we have a microphone that if you do want to make a verbal comment, we'll have Kayla bring the microphone over to you. And if you can just state your name and then your comment, we can make sure that that gets recorded by Carolyn here into the public record. And of course, you can also provide written emailed comments. I think you guys have that information on the handouts. Feel free to send me any comments that you have if that's easier to send them that way. And just a reminder that those are due by December 1st of this year. Okay, we made it. Who wants to